Tokyo, 21:45, 9th of March, 1945. Paper walls sigh with a parched wind as Yoshiko Hashimoto tightens a baby's cloth cap and listens for sirens that have not yet begun. The Sumida River is a thin blade of moonlight beyond the alley. The air smells of rice straw, lacquer, and winter dust. Somewhere a charcoal brazier ticks as it cools. Somewhere a bicycle bell rings twice and is swallowed by quiet. She has rehearsed the drill: bucket, ladle, sand. But the bucket is dented and the ladle is cracked, and the night refuses to explain itself. Across an ocean, a colonel would have initialed a folder and slid it toward Major General Curtis E. LeMay. Weather: humidity in Tokyo under 30%, winds forecast to rise after midnight. Materials: cedar frames, shoji, tatami, resinous varnish. The actuarial maps the Japanese once made to calculate fire insurance have already been copied, squared, and shaded to show which wards will burn fastest. Yoshiko knows none of this. She simply feels the wind change, one dry hand on the back of the city. In the Eastern District Army Post, Lieutenant Ken Sato checks a duty board lit by green lamps. Searchlights need carbons the depot can no longer provide in quantity. Night fighter fuel is rationed. Radar sets work mostly, but the scopes smear at low altitude and the controllers are young. The 1st Anti-Aircraft Division has guns, many calibers, many crews. But tonight they will be firing at shapes they cannot see, into air that refuses to hold a pattern. He draws arcs of predicted fire anyway, pencil steadied by habit and pride. On Guam, a second hand moves. Pathfinders will lift early to seed markers, their brief written in short, hard sentences: cross the city with flame, make an X in Sumida and Honjo, keep the stream tight. The B-29s will go in without most of their guns, trading weight for fire. It sounds like madness until you do the math. Low altitude cancels the jet stream's cruelty. Darkness cancels fighter vectors. Mass cancels hesitation. It is not romance, it is arithmetic. A neighbour knocks, offering a smile too bright for the hour and a coil of rope for tying bundles. Yoshiko accepts and folds a blanket around the baby. She eyes the alley's wooden eaves, cedar darkened by decades of smoke, and imagines them catching like straw if a single cinder lands true. She tells herself that the pumps will hold, that the ward office will send engines with brass bells, that the river will not be needed. The sirens start, one stuttering note that finds its breath and lengthens across the wards. Dogs answer. Doors slide. Somewhere much farther south, engines take throttle and long aluminum bodies begin to roll. The wind shifts again, a dry scrape down every lane, as if the city were being turned to face what is coming. Saipan's Isley Field burned orange in the dusk as floodlights came on one by one, a constellation nailed to coral. Captain Jack R., 73rd Bomb Wing, signed the manifest with a stub of pencil and wiped hydraulic oil from his thumb onto his flight suit. The crew chief had already chalked the numbers on the nose: fuel to the rims, oil topped off for 4 Wright R3350 duplex cyclones, bomb racks loaded with ANM 69 clusters. The guns were mostly gone. Only the tail turret remained, a sting welded to a spine. They would have said it felt wrong to leave the side blisters empty, but LeMay's order was not poetry. It was weight calculus. 7 tons of incendiaries in place of turrets, armour, even 2 gunners left on the hard stand. Pressurization would keep the smoke outside until the leaks found a way in. The flight engineer ran a finger along the engine gauges like a rosary and muttered the order of the start: 2, 3, 1, 4. The props turned, coughed and caught, the familiar saw-toothed song of the duplex cyclones. Taxi! The word felt like a release. Ahead, another B-29 rolled so long and heavy it seemed to swim down the runway on a tide of exhaust. They took the slot in the stream. The navigator clipped his E-6B to a board and checked wind. At low altitude, they would avoid the worst of the jet stream that had made high-level bombing into an exercise in frustration. They were not going to gamble on precision tonight. They were going to drown a grid in fire and let physics do the sorting. As the wheels left Coral and darkness lifted to meet them, Jack felt the shift from individual airplane to system. There were hundreds moving now, 73rd, 313, 314 bomb wings, breathing as one organism. Pathfinders had already gone ahead to draw an X no one in the city below would miss. Someone chuckled once and let it die. The engineer leaned forward, adjusting cowl flaps by feel. The bombardier traced a thumbnail across the interval chart, a private superstition pretending to be a calculation. If you pulled back far enough, you could see the other half of the operation that made the takeoff inevitable, the Battle of Kansas that had turned troublesome prototypes into combat machines. Modification lines in icy hangars had, in 5 weeks, pushed more than 150 B-29s into the fight, an output that would have exceeded Japan's ability to field comparable heavy bombers in the same span. Assembly rhythms in Wichita and Marietta, 1,000 invisible hands, had placed this one airplane here, now, at this exact minute. The runway fell away, a rectangle of magnesium flares and cigarette ends. Jack trimmed, set power, and eased the nose toward the north-northwest. Somewhere far ahead, a city built of wood and hope waited under a dry wind. The crew settled into their stations, and the system, satisfied with the arithmetic, carried them forward. Green lamps gave the command post the pallor of an aquarium. Lieutenant Ken Sato stood at the plotting table and felt the room breathe each time someone opened the blackout curtain to step in from the corridor. Reports came slow, scattered contacts over the bay, altitudes uncertain, bearings drifting. He wrote them down anyway. The 1st Anti-Aircraft Division had trained for altitude and daylight. Night and low level felt like a trick played on logic itself. He checked his list. Searchlight carbons, fuses, pride and patience. Across the ward, Yoshiko folded a blanket, then unfolded it to make it thinner for speed. She had prepared a bundle the way the neighbourhood wardens taught. Papers, photographs, a handful of rice, a teacup for the child. She placed the bucket by the door and rehearsed the path to the firebreak where the street met the river steps. At the next house, a man in a faded uniform beat a gong with a wooden mallet and shouted for people to douse their braziers. No one asked why the wind would listen. On Guam, LeMay put his finger on a map and held it there, as if his will could keep the stream tight. He did not need to be poetic to be persuasive. He needed results that could be written in chalk. The Pathfinder brief had been precise. Enter at 0007, mark Sumida and Honjo, make an X that even a terrified trainee could follow in the dark. The bomber stream would run at roughly 5,000 to 7,000 feet, fast enough to make predictors sluggish, low enough to rob the jet stream of mischief. Gunners left on the ramp meant more fire in the bays. Ken ordered the first barrages by quadrant. The gunners nodded, grateful for verbs that sounded like control. Tracers climbed and then were bent sideways by a wind no instrument could square. He remembered his instructor's insistence on discipline and steadied his voice to the same cadence he used at the range. The radar man called a bearing that felt wrong. Ken ordered it anyway. He would not let the room hear doubt. The impossible statistic was already in motion, even if no one here could see it whole. In a single night, roughly 16 square miles of Tokyo would burn. Roughly 267,000 buildings would be destroyed. By morning, the number of homeless would likely approach 1 million, and the dead would be counted in tens upon tens of thousands. Those numbers seemed unfit for a single line in a ledger, unfit for a voice to carry without breaking, yet they would be true enough to stand in post-war reports. Yoshiko tightened the child to her chest and looked once more at the river's dark ribbon. Ken checked the board and drew another arc. On Guam, a hand came down lightly on a map. 3 separate motions, all part of one arithmetic, turned toward midnight. Over Tokyo Bay at 0007 on 10th March, the first Pathfinders slid under the ragged edge of cloud and released their markers. From the ground, the effect would have looked like stars falling in neat impatience. From the air, it was geometry. 4 points burning toward each other, then crossing into a bright X laid across Sumida and Honjo. The crews flew by radar and dead reckoning, setting their timing to build a moving front of fire. The following waves could follow without questions and without light. Jack's ship felt the air change as they left the sea and crossed the waterfront. The smell made it through the leaks first, a sour heat that was not yet flame, but promised it. The bombardier called the run. They were at about 6,500 feet, throttles set to hold the stream's interval. Below, roofs shivered as the early loads of AN-69s punched through. Each cluster broke into 38 little promises of ruin, time delay bursters spitting napalm into rafters and stairwells, the gel clinging where water would slide away. In the command post, Ken argued with the wind. The radar scope offered returns that seemed to slide, smear, and reappear. He ordered a shift to barrage fire by quadrants, a pattern meant to weave a net from mathematics. The gunners obeyed with the comfort of repetition, traversing through smoke that made the beams look solid. Searchlights stabbed air and found only the halo of their own effort. The first salvos sounded confident. Confidence was the first casualty. Back in the stream, the airplane behaved badly. Updrafts began to climb the stairwells of heat, slapping the B-29 and making the needles quiver. The flight engineer rode the engine temps, nursing the R3350s through air hot enough to taste. The navigator watched drift against radio beacons and made small corrections that felt like secrets, pencil ticking against the board as if counting heartbeats. They could not see the whole of what they were doing. No one could yet. But they could feel the plan biting down, each successive wave adding oxygen to the arithmetic. Yoshiko stepped into the alley because the light had changed. It had a sound, too, like lacquer cracking, like silk being torn by a strong hand. Across the street, a thatch eave took fire with a deep woof, and then the ember rain began. She pulled the blanket over the child's head and ran for the firebreak, hearing a neighbour say the river would save them. The river was a habit, not a plan. From above, the cross looked like navigation. From the ground, it looked like doom had taken a ruler to the night. The stream tightened, and the city's lungs filled with flame. At first, the sound was not a sound at all, but a pressure, the way thunder announces itself through bone. Then the alley learned a new vocabulary: hiss, squall, burster, and the roofs began to cough flame as if startled into it. Yoshiko stepped into heat that reached for her from 3 directions at once. An AN-69 had come through the neighbour's eave and, after its few seconds of thought, opened to spill napalm that crawled like an animal. Tatami lit with a greedy sigh. The air turned brittle and mean, snapping at throats and eyes as if smoke had teeth. Fire crews ran wheezing hand pumps, each stroke a plea against the mathematics. The mains sputtered. Pressure fell as if the city's veins were narrowed by fear. A gust arrived with the authority of weather remade into weapon, lifting burning planks and planing them down the street so cleanly that edges drew blood. A man in a faded uniform grabbed a child with one hand and his bucket with the other, and discovered that 2 hands were not enough. Someone shouted to go toward the river, and a dozen people obeyed the logic of water without quite believing in it. Above, the bomber rode a stairwell of heat. Jack felt the ship buck as an updraft took the port wing, and his engineer called cylinder head temperatures with a calm that only sounded like calm. The R3350S drank air that had already been on fire and did not complain, so long as the cowl flaps were set just so. At 6,500 feet, visibility was smoke and glow. The bomb bay shivered as the racks walked their last clusters into the alleyways below. The smell, how could pressurization keep it out, arrived anyway, a sweet chemical bite threaded with something older, lacquer and pine. Ken's battery fired by quadrant, then by instinct, then by habit. The tracers rose in proud chains and curved away, undone by wind that did not respect geometry. He shifted orders as if changing words could change reality. Searchlights found smoke and made it look like marble. Fighters scrambled in 2s and 3s, brave and late. The map pins mattered less with each minute. The city now provided its own markers, every block another torch to steer by. Yoshiko reached the firebreak and saw the river not as salvation but as argument. Men beat at coats and bundles that had learned to burn from the inside out. A woman tried to put out a child's hair with her bare palms and then held the child anyway. Every breath tasted of tin and lacquer. Upwind, roofs failed in sequence, the failure travelling like applause. The wind, happy with its work, increased. The city was not burning in places, it was learning to burn as one organism, feeding itself, teaching the next block how to ignite. The bomber rode the thermal elevator. The battery obeyed the ritual. The river shone like a blade under falling ash that looked to astonished eyes like black snow. Ken's guns spoke until the barrels glowed a patient cherry. He kept the cadence even, not because it mattered to the airplanes above, but because it mattered to the men below. Predictors clicked and hummed. The numbers they produced were honest and, tonight, almost useless. The wind took good math and bent it. Searchlights read smoke instead of sky and painted columns that looked like monuments to effort. Ken shifted from deliberate fire to barrages by quadrant, then back again, unwilling to concede that ritual could not replace reach. In the stream, Jack called bombs away and felt the airplane grow lighter in a way that always felt like relief, and tonight something crueler. The engineer nursed the R3350S through hot breath and kept the cylinder head temperatures inside the lines. The altimeter quivered as updrafts pushed them toward a sky that suddenly seemed too small. Tail guns only, per the order. The ship felt strangely clean without the old forest of turrets and blisters. He thought of the gunners left on the hard stand, coffee cooling in paper cups, listening to engines they would not ride tonight. On Guam, LeMay paced in a room of maps and clipped voices. Loss reports arrived in fragments, then steadied into a count lower than the most pessimistic boards had warned. Reports from the forward reconnaissance teams, by contrast, grew larger by the hour. Ward blocks blacked out, fire lines merged, smoke towers visible far out to sea. The thing he had argued for in plain language, low night mass, was working with a professionalism that looked like inevitability only after the risk had been paid in advance. Fighters went up because fighters always go up. The 10th Air Division scraped what it could from the line, a handful of machines and men who would have given anything for radar that could see through smoke, for fuel enough to stay aloft longer than a prayer. They searched the glow and found silhouettes that became targets, and then darkness again. A tracer stitched near a B-29 and vanished into the general brightness the city now made for itself. Courage was abundant, capability was scarce. Here is the statistic that modern ears have trouble holding without flinching. In a few hours, the B-29s would drop about 1,665 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo. Each superfortress carried roughly 7 tons. Hundreds flew. The Japanese night fighter force over the capital that night likely counted fewer than 30 serviceable aircraft. One American bomber type, nearly 3,970 B-29s built by war's end, outnumbered by itself Japan's 4-engined fleet by magnitudes. Abundance was not an adjective. It was a doctrine you could count, a ledger filled in advance. Ken called for another pattern and heard his own voice as if it belonged to a stranger. Jack set course for the egress point and felt the ship settle as the heat thinned. On Guam, someone pushed a red peg into a board for a crew that had not come back. The stream continued to move, professional and impersonal, toward the far edge of night. By 1:30, the wards east of the Imperial Palace howled like a forge. The X that Pathfinders had scribed over Sumida and Honjo no longer resembled a cross at all. It had become a wheel, every spoke of flame driving toward its neighbours. Yoshiko clutched her baby and felt the heat before she saw it, a wall that pressed the breath from her lungs. Roof beams popped like rifle shots. The air itself seemed to move with intent, sucking oxygen into the inferno. She joined the stream of neighbours heading toward the Sumida River, the only geography anyone trusted. Jack's B-29 banked for a second pass. Turbulence gripped the aircraft as if an unseen giant had seized it by the wings. The engineer kept a thumb against the cylinder head temperature gauge, the R3350S now drinking air hot enough to sear skin. Jack glimpsed another bomber ahead, its silhouette pitching wildly in the thermal elevator. Below, the city was a single, restless flame. The impossible statistic grew with every minute. Nearly 1,665 tons of incendiaries would fall before dawn, an output that by itself exceeded the annual bomb production of the entire Japanese homeland. In the command post, Ken Sato wiped sweat that had nothing to do with exertion. His men were firing blind, their tracers swallowed by smoke that reflected its own red light. Each predicted fire solution died in the gusts. Each order felt like a ritual spoken to keep fear at bay. He thought of the 10th Air Division pilots scrambling on meagre fuel and of the hundreds of heavy bombers above, more four-engined aircraft in one night than his nation had produced in years. On Guam, LeMay listened to the radio net. Loss reports came in lower than feared. 14 aircraft confirmed down so far, far fewer than the boards had warned. Chalk on the map turned entire city blocks black before the reconnaissance planes had even returned. Doctrine, hastily rewritten only days before, was proving itself in fire. The Sumida River shimmered like molten glass as people waded in to escape the heat. Ash drifted down in flakes the size of coins, black snow settling on the living and the dead. Yoshiko reached the water's edge and felt the wind scour her back. The city behind her transformed into a furnace that would not cool before sunrise. While Tokyo burned, another night kept its own tempo half a world away. In Wichita, the midnight shift of the Battle of Kansas worked under sodium lamps, rivet guns hammering a rhythm that drowned winter's chill. 5 weeks of relentless labour had already delivered more than 150 B-29s to combat units, a single modification push that outproduced what Japan could have built in heavy bombers in an entire year. On Saipan, Seabees graded coral to extend an 8,500-foot runway, even as the latest stream of superfortresses droned north. The war's largest industrial machine worked without pause, and every motion here became flame there. Jack's crew felt the distant echo of that abundance. They flew because the factories had already solved problems for them. Stronger spars, improved superchargers, pressurized cabins that kept the crew alive while letting the smell of Tokyo's lacquered timbers leak in through imperfect seals. The R3350S roared, drinking high-octane fuel shipped in tankers that crossed a Pacific owned by American logistics. A democracy had weaponized its own idea of surplus, enough hands, enough steel, enough time, to build a bomber that could carry 7 tons of fire over 1,500 miles and return to tell the story. Ken could only imagine such scale. His battery's ammunition was counted in shells per night, not tons per hour. Japan's aviation fuel reserves shrank each week, its aluminum output a fraction of what the United States produced in a single day. Even before the first American bomb touched Tokyo, the math of production had already written the war's outcome. The men on his line fought bravely, but bravery could not multiply factories. LeMay, hearing the latest damage reports, understood that the night's raid was not an end, but a template. Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, each name already penciled onto a board in Guam. The B-29s would return night after night until the maps of Japan's great cities were no more than negative space. Abundance was not merely a resource, it was a weapon sharpened by democratic will. Somewhere in Kansas, a rivet gun stopped, then started again. In Saipan's humid dark, another bomber took off into the Pacific. The same motion that tightened a bolt in America set loose a river of fire an ocean away. In Guam's operations center, chalk squeaked as altitude figures were struck through and rewritten. LeMay had gambled on night, low altitude, and incendiary saturation, and the evidence was now undeniable. The jet stream's high-level winds, once a torment to precision raids, were irrelevant when the bombers flew at 5,000 feet. Precision was no longer a virtue. Mass was. The success of Meeting House codified a doctrine that would, within weeks, be repeated across Japan's urban heart. Ken read a circular promising reinforcements and improved radar sets. He knew better. Fuel was short, spare parts scarcer still. The 10th Air Division's handful of night fighters could not challenge hundreds of superfortresses. Every engagement was a brave gesture against arithmetic. He thought of the pilots who would fly into the glowing sky above Osaka next, and wondered whether courage without means was a kind of cruelty. Jack's navigator recalculated drift corrections while still in the egress pattern, pencil trembling from the memory of turbulence. The crew exchanged glances that were equal parts relief and disbelief. 14 bombers lost, far below the predicted 70% attrition some had feared. The odds themselves were now proof of American capacity, a nation able to field hundreds of heavy bombers, accept even catastrophic loss, and yet suffer only a fraction. Stateside, production planners read the early communiques and accelerated schedules. B-29 output would climb toward 3,970 before war's end. The impossible comparison became a point of quiet pride. In 5 weeks, the United States had delivered more combat-ready B-29s than Japan would build 4-engined bombers in the entire war. Doctrine had pivoted overnight, but it was no reckless improvisation. It was the natural expression of an industrial democracy able to test, adapt, and mass-produce on a scale that autocracy could not match. The path from Wichita to Guam to Tokyo was shorter than any enemy had imagined, and it was paved in steel and decisions made at speed. Someone erased the board and wrote the next targets, Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, in firm, dry strokes. What had begun as a gamble was now policy. Sunrise revealed what night had only suggested. From the reconnaissance planes, Tokyo looked like the negative of a photograph. 16 square miles of ash where neighborhoods had been, 267,000 buildings reduced to black geometry. Smoke columns drifted higher than Mount Fuji's distant peak. The dead would be counted at 90 to 100,000, the homeless near 1 million, figures that rivaled or surpassed Dresden and Hamburg combined. The world's deadliest single air raid had ended hours earlier, but its arithmetic continued to settle. Jack's crew, engines droning on the long return, counted the empty stations where 2 gunners should have sat. They had traded those men for firepower, and the trade had worked. Relief blurred with a quieter unease. Victory carried a weight that settled only in silence. The engineer wiped sweat from a face streaked with ash drawn through the pressurization leaks. He did not speak. Yoshiko picked through a firebreak, now carpeted with survivors and ash. The river lapped against banks rimed in charcoal dust. She found a kettle fused to stone and, miraculously, a neighbour's child alive beneath a scorched blanket. The smell of lacquer and burned rice straw clung to everything. What the fire had not taken, the smoke had marked. Ken supervised the cooling of gun barrels that hissed when touched with water. He tallied shells expended and found no comfort in the number. They had fired everything and changed nothing. The city he had sworn to defend lay gutted beyond recognition. He did not yet know that Kobe and Osaka would follow, that tonight's nightmare would become a routine. On Guam, LeMay listened to final loss reports, 14 bombers gone, 96 men missing or dead, and noted them in a hand that did not tremble. For all its moral ambiguity, the raid had proven a principle. Industrial democracy, married to air power, could unmake an enemy capital without invasion. The black snow over Sumida was both evidence and omen. The sun rose higher, catching the river in a sudden gleam. It looked from a distance like a ribbon of molten glass through a city of cinders. A chalkboard in Guam bore a list of cities already chosen for fire: Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama. Next to each name, LeMay's staff left a column for square miles burned and tons of incendiary dropped. By the summer of 1945, more than 60 Japanese cities would bear those marks. Meeting House was not an exception. It was the beginning of a methodical siege conducted from the air. Operational economy shaped every decision. B-29s mined Japan's shipping lanes in Operation Starvation while continuing night incendiary raids. Each mission layered deprivation on destruction. Japanese industrial output plummeted month by month. The nation's aviation fuel stocks dwindled to days of supply. American sortie losses remained below the feared levels, proof that the gamble of low altitude and night had paid dividends far beyond the first raid. Ken read the after-action reports with a numb clarity. He saw in the figures the story his eyes already knew, an enemy capable of producing in a single month what Japan could not hope to replace in a year. Courage among his men remained, but material reality had outflanked valor. The war would not end in heroic counterattack. It would end when the arithmetic reached its final column. Jack, back on Saipan, watched maintenance crews swarm his B-29 before the engines cooled. They worked with a practiced speed that belonged to an economy as much as to an army. Stateside factories continued their relentless pace. By war's end, nearly 3,970 B-29s would have been built. That single production line outstripped Japan's entire wartime output of comparable aircraft many times over, an impossible statistic that required no embellishment. LeMay stood beneath the chalkboard, its margins already crowded, and knew that the campaign's logic left few targets worthy of another night's work. The siege from the sky was nearly complete. America's abundance of men, machines, and democratic will had done what armies and navies alone could not. It had ended the concept of sanctuary. Someone erased the bottom of the board to make room for more cities. The chalk dust settled like a pale echo of the smoke that still darkened Tokyo's horizon. Years later, in a quiet museum gallery, an inert M69 bomblet rested in a glass case beside a reconnaissance photograph of Tokyo that looked like the surface of the moon. Visitors paused before the small cylinder, reading the plaque. Weight carried 7 tons per aircraft. The number alone was astonishing. The context made it nearly unbelievable. LeMay's own words, recorded years after the war, played softly from a speaker. If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. It was not confession so much as recognition of the razor's edge where strategy meets law. He knew that democratic abundance had made such destruction possible. He also knew that the same system demanded accountability even when it won. Jack, long retired, still woke at times to the memory of lacquer smoke seeping through pressurization leaks. He had carried 7 tons of fire and returned to a country that could outproduce the world. Ken, in post-war Tokyo, helped rebuild the city he had failed to defend. He hammered nails into new cedar beams and felt the echo of a night when courage was not enough. Yoshiko kept the kettle she had found fused to stone, a relic of survival and loss, and told her grandchildren of the night black snow fell on the river. American industrial democracy had proved more than the sum of its factories. It had transformed free citizens into the most effective fighting force in history, and in doing so revealed a paradox, that the same abundance capable of liberating Europe and Asia could also unmake a city in a single night. Freedom's price was measured not only in blood and steel, but in the burden of memory. The photograph on the wall showed the Sumida River glinting like a black ribbon through the ashes. Beside it, the brass plaque kept its silence, allowing the weight of 7 tons to speak for itself.